Medieval people lived in a time when food was scarce and harvests were much smaller than they are today. These limitations, combined with the rigid structure of medieval society, shaped the diets of peasants in fascinating ways. In medieval Europe, the vast majority of the population were peasants, farmers who lived in rural villages and worked the land. Their life was structured around the agricultural calendar, with days filled by hard physical labor. Most peasants did not own the land they farmed. They worked estates owned by nobles or the church, often required to give a portion of their crops as rent or tax. Nearly everything people consumed had to be produced locally. Without modern tools, transportation, or refrigeration, diets were restricted by geography, season, and social class. Core staples. The medieval peasant's diet was maybe not as elaborate or varied as the food of the nobility, but it varied more than you might think. The staple food for most medieval peasants was bread, made from the flour of whatever grains were available locally. This varied by region, but common grains included rye, barley, oats, and, less frequently, wheat. Wheat was preferred because it produced a lighter and more palatable bread, but it was also more expensive and less accessible to peasants. Most peasants relied on coarser bread made from whole grains. Because few had personal ovens, baking was often done in communal ovens shared by the village. Producing white flour was more labor-intensive and resulted in more waste, making it a luxury reserved for wealthier classes. Alongside bread, another staple of the medieval peasant diet was pottage, a thick stew made by boiling grains in water. This could be enriched with available herbs, vegetables, legumes, and occasionally meat or fish when available. Common vegetables in the peasant diet included cabbage, chard, onions, and garlic. These were often added to pottage or served as side dishes. Legumes such as beans and peas were vital sources of protein. Because they could be dried and stored, they were used throughout the year, especially in winter when fresh food was scarce. Fish also played an important role in the diet, especially due to Christian rules that restricted meat consumption on certain days and during Lent. Access to fish, however, depended on location and legal rights. Peasants who lived near rivers, lakes, or the sea might need permission from their local lord to fish. Common fish included mackerel, eels, and cod, as well as preserved forms such as salted fish and pickled herring. Roasted eel was considered a delicacy. Among domesticated animals, pigs were especially common. They could forage in forests or around the village and eat scraps, making them cheap to raise. Chickens were also widely kept. They required little maintenance. Their small size made them easier to sustain through the winter months. In areas where cattle were raised, dairy products such as milk, cheese, and butter were also part of the diet. Supplemental foods. Medieval peasants did not have the ability to buy a wide variety of foods year-round, but they supplemented their staple foods in a variety of interesting ways. In coastal areas, seafood was a common addition. Lobster, crab, crayfish, clams, oysters, mussels, squid, and eel were all consumed when they could be caught or purchased. Inland, freshwater fish and preserved fish from fishmongers played a similar role. Fruits were widely eaten, either raw or cooked, and frequently used in desserts. Berries such as raspberries, wild strawberries, and blueberries were foraged from the wild, while nuts like hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were gathered in woodlands. Honey served as the primary sweetener for most peasants. Beekeeping was common, valued not only for honey, but also for beeswax, which was used to make candles. Foraged greens, including nettles and other wild plants, were regularly incorporated into meals to boost nutrition. While chickens were the more common poultry, some peasants who could afford it kept geese, which were more expensive to buy. Not every peasant had access to enough land to fully sustain a family, so food was often supplemented through buying or bartering. Markets, traveling merchants, and fishmongers provided opportunities to acquire goods they couldn't grow or raise themselves. In or near towns, prepared meals could be purchased from cooks, such as pie makers, roasters, and street vendors. Still, diets were bound by local availability and the changing seasons. In the winter months especially, food options became simpler, with much less variety. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to not miss any upcoming videos. Seasonal variations. Compared to today, medieval diets relied heavily on what time of year it was, and they had to adapt to the changing seasons in interesting ways. To cope with seasonal changes and ensure food availability throughout the year, medieval peasants had to be resourceful, relying on a range of preservation techniques. Fruits such as apples and pears were often dried during harvest seasons to help sustain households through the barren winter months. Herbs played a key role in the peasant diet year-round. Thanks to drying methods, herbs like parsley and sage, typically grown in small kitchen gardens, remained available even in winter. These herbs were vital for flavoring, especially since salted or dried foods often lost much of their original taste. Seasonings were not a luxury but a practical way to make preserved meals more palatable. They salted, smoked, dried, pickled foods in vinegar or candied fruits to extend shelf life. Hunting was strictly regulated throughout medieval Europe, and for most peasants, it was either heavily restricted or outright forbidden. Forests, woodlands, and game animals were typically the property of the local lord, the monarchy, or the church. As a result, wild game was rarely part of the peasant diet. Hunting rights were a privilege of the nobility. Eating habits and religious practices. You might think medieval diets were shaped mostly by what they could harvest, but one of the most powerful influences came from the church. Christianity played a central role in medieval life, and it had a significant influence on dietary habits, dictating not only what people could eat, but when they could eat it. Following the church's dietary rules was a big part of medieval life. There was a deep connection between daily routines and religious devotion, with food serving as both sustenance and spiritual discipline. One of the most important religious periods affecting diet was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. During Lent, Christians were expected to fast and abstain from certain luxuries as an act of penitence and reflection. The church mandated that the consumption of meat from four-legged animals and fowl during Lent, and on specific days, particularly Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, was prohibited. These restrictions also extended to animal products such as eggs, cheese, and milk. Beyond Lent, the church designated many feast days and additional periods of abstinence throughout the year. These religious observances were deeply woven into the fabric of medieval society, making dietary restrictions a regular part of life. The medieval peasant diet offered limited variety compared to modern standards, yet it was robust in certain respects. It was largely composed of whole, minimally processed foods, with a much lower intake of sugar, additives, and refined products than what is common today. In this sense, it could be considered healthier in some ways. However, it also lacked many of the aspects of modern nutrition. The diet often fell short in terms of variety, though it needed to provide enough calories to support the demands of hard physical labor. The diet of medieval European peasants was shaped by necessity, geography, and societal structure. Though limited in variety, it was rooted in whole foods, seasonal rhythms, and practical knowledge of preservation and foraging. If you enjoyed the video, do not forget to subscribe to not miss any upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.